Well, okay, Casio HT-6000 is a synthesizer that Casio introduced in late 1987, and it was a complete flop. This is actually a flagship model of only 6 models that Casio ever made of synthesizers that utilize a technology that they called SD synthesis. Spectrum dynamics. The oscillators frequencies are dynamic, they're not static. Unfortunately, it's 1987, so that means that its sound source is a 4-bit digitally controlled oscillator, or DCO, but 4 bits means that it's only 16 steps. That means that instead of being able to draw a straight line in a fine way, it's jagged, so those 16 steps, yeah, you will definitely see them once we start exploring the oscillators. Brief history of models. They started with the model HZ-600, which was the first SD synthesizer, and was the only synthesizer that was built to actually look like a professional keyboard, meaning no speakers, no batteries and things like that. I think it didn't have batteries. Everything after that is just a mess, which in many ways HT-6000 is a culmination of that mess. So then we have MT-600 and HT-700, which are basically the same keyboard, except the HT version you can edit patches, and MT you just kind of play. After that, Casio introduced HT-3000 and 3500, which seemed to be just the same synthesizer, different markets. And this one was a step more. It had 32 oscillators, but it only had one analog filter. It was still 8 polyphony, but it's one analog filter, which means that on each note trigger, the envelope was re-triggered. Pretty much the same deal as Korg Poly 800. But this is where HT-6000 comes into play. HT-6000 had 64 different wave shapes, 4 oscillators that can be played at the same time, and 8 polyphony, but most importantly 8 independent filters, which means that the filters were per node specific, so the envelope didn't retrigger every single time. So in many ways what we're reviewing today is a pinnacle and an end of Casio's attempt at SD synthesis. So let's dig in and first check it out. What does it actually look like? What's it made out of? And then we're going to dig in deeper. When you first encounter HT-6000, portability is not the first word that comes to mind. This is a big and a heavy keyboard, and it does not look particularly nice. We're talking like 8 analog fully resonant filters, 64 wave shapes, 4 oscillators, and all of this is encased in full-on plastic. Horrible feeling keyboard. Glaring at you are 2 speakers. They have included stereo outs, headphone outs, and MIDI. However, even though MIDI implementation is there, it's fairly limited and there's not too much that you can actually do. And again, it's a strange choice of what they chose to be implemented and controlled via MIDI and what not. Front panel is completely in the 80s style. There are only 2 dials and a small LCD display, which is not backlit, and it's full of buttons and just buttons. So if you remember the digital era of 1980s, that was the norm. No knobs, just buttons, and keep it sleek. Thankfully they did include those 2 knobs, so editing of patches and creating patches is not as painful as on Chord Poly 800, but it's not a lot better either. Whenever I get a new old keyboard, one of the first things I actually do when I bring it into house is to open it up and clean it up thoroughly. Usually I dismantle them completely and then just wash everything inside out so that I'm sure that everything is clean. When I brought HT-6000 home, I opened it up and I encountered another problem with this design. Even though it's 1987, by that time, or 1988, other synthesizers from that era all are using normal plugs, connectors, and things like that. This thing, from the moment you open it up, every single wire, lead, connector, stripe, every single thing is soldered directly onto the board. This one I just opened up, scratched my head, and kind of closed it back down because there's no way I'm going to be doing that. So if you do get one with intent to repair it or things like that, please keep in mind that it's not that easy. It's actually quite unusual, especially the stripe connectors that are soldered directly onto the boards. That's not fun to do. Alright, so this is it, and we got the keypad here. Pitch and modulation wheel. Modulation is turned on or off using this little button on the side, so that's all standard. Power on, and here we have accompaniment level, rhythm level, and main volume. So basically these are several parts that this keyboard has. And after that it's just rows of buttons. These are mainly associated with the upper tone and the lower tone. You can actually split the keyboard using the split button. So keyboard split, this means this is the lower tone. These keys will play the upper tone, and if you press it several more times, you can split the key up to here or up to here. After that you have Casio chord options. Presets on HT-6000 are divided into preset, internal, and if you have a card, then on the card as well. So basically it just works like that, and you'll see that you have two rows of text. So that effectively means that you have 40 presets. You have 20 in preset, 20 in internal. For the upper tone, you have the same thing for the lower tone, except that it's divided into bass tone and obligato tone, and this is where you actually switch these things when you're in this chord mode. So let's do the split. This is the lower tone, this is the upper tone. So here I can change that's the upper tone, lower tone, or internal. HT-6000 has 4 oscillators, but they can't use different wave shapes. They all have to use the same wave shape that is selected, but they can be detuned, their volumes can be changed, and their velocity responsiveness can be changed via strange input called line editing. You have at your disposal 64 wave shapes, and because it's using the SD synthesis technology, that means that some of them are static and standard as you're used to, like saw, pulse, sine, but some of them are actually dynamic. The first bank is 32 wave shapes, and as far as I understand, they're exactly the same as on HT-3000 and 3500. But where HT-6000 excels is they added a second bank of 32 new wave shapes, and these are fully dynamic, and some of them are actually 2 wave shapes. Basically, you can have a normal oscillator and a noise source in there, which can be regulated with a noise envelope. And others are actually even ring mod oscillators. Oscillator 4 affects oscillator 3. We shall also explore that as well. All of this gives you a lot of power to actually play around with, and even though you have that limitation of that all 4 oscillators have to use the same wave shape, there's so many ways that they can interact with each other that it's really easy to make very interesting, very dynamic and lively sounds. When editing a program, basically this is the row of buttons that you will be using, and these 2 dials, and of course the display. Basically you can edit the upper tone or the lower tone, or enter editing of the patterns. What's completely priceless is this listing here, and this conveniently tells you what number corresponds to which parameter when you're doing upper tone edit, lower tone edit, and pattern edit. The confusing part is here, but this is basically, you can think of line 1, line 2, line 3, line 4. Just replace line as oscillator, so you will have oscillator editor, and then you have oscillator 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it actually works. And within each line or oscillator you can do detune, amplitude, or velocity. So then it becomes pretty much straightforward. So let's see how does the editing actually look like, and let's start listening to some of the basic oscillators. So basic editing, you want to edit the tone that you want, so you just go into upper tone, and the display has changed now to 0, 0, and 1. Now you change the value of which parameter you want with the mode, and you input the value that you want with the tempo or data wheel. So pretty much straightforward. So let's say that we want to edit an upper tone, and I have conveniently created init patch, basically, which uses 1 oscillator, and it's using a sine wave, or what they call a sine wave. So you'll see that since we're interested in oscillators here, we're interested in parameters 0, 0 and 0, 1, because these are waveform 1 and waveform 2. So that means that if I go into my upper tone on programmer and choose mode 0, 0 or 0, 1, here I can actually choose the tone for my oscillator. So when I listen to this sine, in the upper register, sounds smooth and nice, but lower you go, now it no longer actually sounds like a sine, it's all jaggedy and weird. So I actually wanted to see what's going on. My suspicion was that the 4-bit or the 16-step DCO is not up to par to actually generate a low sine wave. Let's check out the oscilloscope. So if we start high, sure enough, smooth, a little bit more jaggedy. Ooh. Ooh. Now this is no longer sine, and when you go low, this is really not a sine. This is some kind of weird sine with saws and some kind of weird things. So if you're looking for a pure, clean, silky sine oscillator in this keyboard, you will not be able to find it because it's not able to generate it. Having this in mind, with the oscilloscope on, I wanted to actually double check and see how other oscillators are. And there are 64 of them, so I'm just going to go quickly through them. But in the user manual, on page 19, they list all of the 64 waveforms available. Now, they don't say exactly where the noise ones are, and we're going to be covering that as well. For now, this is the basic stuff, how it works. So, but yeah, definitely get the manual, and this is where you will have all the basic wave shapes. I went through them all, and they sort of resemble the stuff that's illustrated, but not completely. So, for example, saw. Yes, it resembles a saw. So let's say higher register, it's definitely a saw. But you can see that the slope is downwards. It's a downward slow, not an upward slow. And what they have shown is an upward saw. So there are some discrepancies and kind of weirdness, but at least saw sounds like saw. And what's interesting is if you go into the amplitude level, these are your 4 oscillators. So basically, if I lower down the amplitude or the volume, you still hear a little bit, but it's very, very low. And then you can put oscillator 1 on. Now let's add oscillator 2. Alright, and 3. You can't do multiple at the same time, so I tried, but it doesn't work. And this always reminds me of the time machine from Back to the Future. So maybe you should want to have like a DeLorean on here. So now we have 4. The detune is where the things actually get quite interesting. So let's hear detune here. Alright. Now this sound has absolutely nothing in there. This is basically, simply pure output just recorded, not like in the intro where I had a bunch of stuff on. This is the pure output of the synthesizer itself. And despite all the limitations and things, sounds better. Sounds quite a lot better. So let's try and detune a little bit more. Let's try and break it down a little. So the detune goes up to 31. It's detune and fine tune. After 31, it's half steps. So nice and massive. So basically, if you add some reverb to it and a little bit of delay, you're gonna start having very, very interesting fatty sounds. So that's what we can get with the basic saw, and a little bit of detune and a little bit of amplitude. And then you can also play around with the velocities and get different types of responses. As far as velocity goes, you get to have these 9 curves, or 10 curves, sorry. And the way the display works is a little weird. You can see 29, 29, 29. It's not the amount. The first digit, if I remember correctly, the first digit determines the velocity type. So you can go from 0 to 9. So this would be velocity type 2, which means you find it on the graph, and that's like an upward slope. And the second digit in line is the intensity of the velocity. So 2, 9 is the maximum velocity using velocity curve 2. So that's quite confusing unless you actually read it in the manual. And the velocity actually works both for filter and it works in the same way for filter and for the amplitude. We have sine, saw-ish. Let's see, there we go, saw-ish. Then a square, which is not exactly a square, and it's the same deal for all of them because this is the resolution of the DCO. So on high notes it resembles it properly, on low notes it starts losing its shape, but it has interesting harmonics. So then you go through different pulses. These are not modulatable, so you can't really do any kind of pulse width modulation type of stuff, unfortunately. And now we start getting into these more complex kind of waves, and this is sort of like a sine with a peak up and down, a little bit more jaggedy. We're adding some double harmonics, triple harmonics, offset, kind of sync sound. Now these are quite starting to be kind of like a sync sound. Now this is all one oscillator still. Dry. So let's add a tiny bit of reverb and a little bit of delay. So nice organ type of sound for the as an oscillator. More harmonics and different drawbars and everything like that. So you can actually get quite interesting sounds. So that's the batch of waveforms number 1. Now when you actually go into wave number 2, you're gonna see something slightly different. First one is weird. That looks like a noise kind of source, right? If you can see it here. Can't really hear much, and the second one as well. Almost like a noise. Then you get to the sine. Now we get to have a pulse. And at a certain point we also had a reverse saw. And at first glance, these don't seem to do a lot, anything special, but they are divided into two groups. A group from, waveform 01, and these are the special ones for the HT-6000. So waveforms from 0 to 16 or to 15 are actually include noise in them. And the group from 16 to 31, they actually can ring modulate, they have ring modulation in them. So let's examine this a little bit more. But in order to check this out, we have to introduce the noise ADSR, or noise envelope. And these are parameters from 27, 28, 29, and 30, and that's respectively noise ADSR. So the basic values, in order to actually have some, let's make sure that our attack is super low. So that's 27, put it at 0, 28, 0. My sustain to the maximum and release. And there we go. Now the one that was like nothing is actually noise, but it's not a true noise generator. This is just a noise DCO. So this one is cheating. This is simply an oscillator that's not even, well, I guess it's looped, but it has 16 steps and you can definitely hear them. It more sounds like an Atari or something, so not exactly a great noise source. But let's make some kind of meaningful ADSR here. So let's make a little bit of, a in. Let's make a bit of short. Okay, that's not bad. So let's go back now to parameter 01, which is our waveforms, and cycle through these that actually contain noise in them. So we have, oops, let's see, this is a different one. Aha! Now what's interesting is, even though you have super limited control, you do get the separate envelope for the noise. So while the node stops, the noise can continue. But you don't really have a proper level of noise. You have to adjust that with the decay and sustain level. So that's how that goes, but it's quite interesting. And they actually combine those two different noise sources that they showed in 0 and 1. And some of them will have fixed rising rates. It's not even an attack, they just kind of rise in a way. A little bit of pulse width with noise. And from what I can see, up to 16, it's the same waveforms from the waveform 1, 0 to 16 or to 15, but with variations of noise added. So, alright, that's fine. But you'll notice that as soon as we have noise here, and from 16 and onwards, there's no noise. You can actually hear anything. That's because these contain ring modulation, and this is a little weird because it's not explained anywhere and it was kind of hard to find. Ring modulation in this one works, there's two gotchas. It works so that oscillator 4 is ring modulating oscillator 3. So that means that we don't need oscillator 1, we just want to hear oscillator 3. and the ring modulation itself is controlled via the detune parameter. So let's kind of find, okay, so we are there. So if I now start detuning, but you can actually create some really weird things with this. Alright, so I'm going to try and not use as much effect so that you can actually hear exactly what you can get. So there's no delay here, there's no effects, nothing, so you can hear it, but because of all these things that are happening, Alright, so filters. HT-6000 has one polyphonic filter. That means that your filter envelope will behave normally. Now, HT-6000 only has two envelopes, one for amp, one for filter, and they cannot be routed anywhere else, or you can't do really anything with them. Unfortunately, it only has one LFO as well, and that's simply assigned to the vibrato. You can do some basic changes to the vibrato itself, change the shape, the waveform, frequency, and the delay. So you still can add a little bit of expressivity to your patches, but unfortunately it's very limited how far up the frequency range goes. Very, very low. You can't assign it to the filter at all. The filter is parameter 14 is the cutoff and 15 is resonance. Resonance goes only up to 7, so it's really weak. But the biggest problem is that the filter itself, because of the limited resolution of the digital part of this synth, yeah, it just goes up to 31. So that means really, really steppy. Which is kind of bad because it's a very nice filter. It's not really juicy or anything like that, but it's nice and smooth. Resonance up. This is as maximum it will go. So really nothing special, but it's there. If you plan to use it for, you know, like, it doesn't really work. Plus you can't do it because MIDI implementation on this is stupid. You can control separate lower part, upper part. You can actually change patterns and control all kinds of stuff, but you can't control any of these program parameters. So no real sysx actually exist, which means that you can't save your patches as sysx, you can't load them, and most importantly, you can't use an external controller to control all of these things. So that's a huge negative point. Alright, so those are the things that you can't do with it. But what can you do? There's two things that we can do. We've already had interesting harmonics and lots of interesting stuff going on with the oscillators only, so now when you actually employ the filter as well, then it's quite nice. So it works as just dulling down the tone a little. You don't have to go too much. And you get kind of nicer, smoother, silkier texture. What else can we do with it? Well, you can make it key follow, which is not terribly interesting. But yeah, the only true level of control that we have for it is the VCF envelope. And those are the parameters 10, 11, 12, and 13. Attack, decay, sustain, and release. You can just do standard stuff for your VCF. So let's make a little bit of a trumpety sound or whatever. I really don't like those. This is the longest attack that you can get. So let's adjust a little bit more. Add a little bit of resonance. Alright, so that's basically the VCF and how it works with the VCF, and since we're here, let's just cover normal envelope, and in this patch I'm just gonna give it a little bit more of a paddy kind of feel. So release, sustain is going to be a little bit lower, and a bit of decay, quite a lot of decay, and slowest attack. Now, again, we have only one oscillator, and since we're making a pad, let's add all four of them and detune them a little. And we're using a basic saw that this guy has, because that's something that you can compare easily. So I've just added the volume, equal volume on all of them, and I'm gonna add a detune. So that's raw. Let's add a little bit of reverb and delay. Not a little, a lot. Now let's make it a little bit more interesting as well. Let's kill the reverb and delay. And add a little bit of LFO. Now unfortunately the only thing we can do with the LFO is vibrato. We can go back to upper tone and let's see how much vibrato depth do we want. So because the vibrato is shared on the modulation wheel, if you have modulation on, it will effectively override the vibrato setting that you have there in the patch. So that's a little bit much. But let's examine which shapes we have. So we have obviously a sine, downward saw, upward saw, square, and random sample and hold, I guess. This is interesting. But let's go back to down. You can hear that because of the release we've started to eat up poly. So this is 8 poly, so we have now 6 notes. We've cut them. But that's where reverb actually comes into play, and then you really won't hear these kinds of things. And let's shorten the delay of vibrato a little bit, so it comes in sooner. So, there you go. That will be the filters and the envelopes and the LFO all together. Not much, but what is there, it actually works properly, and more importantly, all together in combination with the oscillators and everything, it makes for a nice harmonic assembly. And once you add the effects to it, it sounds good, it sounds nice, it sounds smooth. And if you don't force it to do what it doesn't want to do, then yeah, then you're fine. And it can actually produce some quite nice tones. The next part of HT-6000 that's interesting is basically the rhythm section itself and the primitive sequencer that it has. Now, initially, it's very funny. You can go. So then you can play your split. You can play normally without the split. God damn, that's awful. And also you have Casio chord, which and this is where you have obbligato and all that kind of stuff. And this works basically so that you can I can't think while this is going on. This works so that the sequence stuff will be played by the lower tone, and it will then use bass and obbligato tone for different kinds of sequences, because the sequencer itself has 3 tracks, the rhythm, bass and chord. And that's basically what you can add into it. And you can program separately intro and fill in. There's no step sequence or anything like that. You just like press play, and what you play is what you get. The way you actually record these patterns are in pattern or MIDI programmer. And when you go into pattern, 0-0 is your rhythm, and the second 0 is the mode, if you can have rehearse, load and save, or rehearse, save and load. And the same thing goes for 10, which is chord, and 20, which is bass. And then you also have some chord operations and etc., some other kind of settings. So now when you enter the recording mode of or rhythm pattern record mode, now these keys will not do anything. But you have little icons here which resemble or represent different instruments of the drum. So you have the bass drum, snare, other snare, tom, terrible. But that's what they have. They have some charm if you actually just explode them with compression, limiting, and distortion. Then you can actually get some quite gritty and interesting sounds, because these are really, really low resolution. So, so that's how you enter your pattern record mode. Then you press right, and then you press start. So you can actually, once you're in the write and start-stop mode, you can add different types of notes that you want. So we can add a cowbell. Alright, so that's how that works. Deleting stuff is a little weird. The highest C note, I think it's C5, C6 or something, on the keyboard, when it has delete on top of it. So if you press that key while you're in the write mode, and let's say that I want to delete these little guys, so I'm just gonna press and hold delete. You can't see it in the shot, but that's what I'm doing now. And if I press and hold these two, the notes that I don't want to be here, as long as you hold them pressed with the delete, it works like an erase button. So let's kill the cowbell. Let's kill the toms. Alright, let's kill the ride. But remember, you have to keep holding it down, and then it just erases it. If you want to erase the entire pattern, then you press and hold the delete key and you press start. And once you've pressed start, we're in start mode and it's completely empty. Let's just give it some. Alright, that works. Now I inadvertently hit the toms, so let's delete the toms, holding delete button, and this guy, they're out. Now let's say I really don't like the closed hat. So that's that. Absolutely the same way it works for the bass and the chord. So let's say that I wanted to, and since I don't want to write, if you wanted to write, you would just select which section you want to write it to. So let's say I want to record the bass, which is 20, and now I just press write and then start. that's pretty much it. And then you just write and you just select which section where you would like to write it down to. Alright, so that was a lot of stuff to cover. As the series is called, it's deep dive. So the whole point is to explore interesting bits of technology in depth and analyze them so that people can actually find a good reference on stuff that they might be interested in. I think this is an incredibly interesting bit of hardware that's horribly underrated for a good reason. This was a complete mess from Casio's side. They've tried to build a synthesizer, which is a powerful synthesizer, and then they tamed it down and wrapped it up into a package of a home keyboard. I don't understand. I really do not understand the logic behind that. Overall, what do I think about this keyboard? It's an ugly duckling. It's definitely not one to replace all of your needs. It's not something that's gonna sound lush and fantastic like any analog keyboard that you can compare to. It's not even that strong compared to various VA keyboards. But because it uses the 4-bit or the 16-step DCO, that imperfection and those limitations, I think, give it the character. And once you get into it, you can really start to appreciate the roundness and smoothness of the sound that it gives. It's not gonna give you fat sounding poly sounds, but with a little bit of reverb and a little bit of EQing, you can get something that sounds authentic, if you know what I mean. Which means that it's not gonna sound like anything else. It has character, it has charm, and it definitely is an instrument that you can actually play around with and have fun with. And all of these things, when you add together that you have this weird drum machine to play around with, and you have a sequencer, a 2-bar sequencer, you can add a bass, you can add a chord progression, you can add leads, you can do all sorts of things. End result is you start with this really silly kind of approach to it, at least I do, and then I start having fun, and quickly, very quickly from fun, something nice and interesting is being produced. And that's why this keyboard or this synthesizer, I don't know which one it is, it synthesizes sound, so it's a synthesizer. That's why it definitely falls into the deep dive category, because if nothing else, it's very, very interesting. So if you do have an opportunity to actually pick this up for a reasonable price, I think that if you like what you see and you like what you hear, you should definitely go for it, because it's unlike anything else that I've played. And to be honest, for 2 years I've been trying to get rid of it, as in I decide I'm gonna sell it, right? Get it out and I start playing it, and I end up using it for a couple of months, and then it's like I'm gonna sell it again, pick it up, start using it again, and I just, no, it's too interesting. I can't really part with it. So for now it stays with me, and I hope that some of you will maybe find this video interesting. And if you do like the keyboard, please do share all of your work that you have. It's interesting to hear what other people can do with the synth. So yeah, hope you enjoyed the video, and see you in the next episode. Bye!